Joining me now is economist, journalist, author, and former Assistant Treasury Secretary, Mr. Paul Craig Roberts. Mr. Roberts, how are you doing today?
I'm just fine, thank you, Evan.
Now, I want to start off by asking you, it was recently announced that Timothy Geithner, former Secretary of the Treasury and New York Fed President, he's moving to a lucrative job at private equity firm Warburg Pincus. Is this move unexpected to you?
No, of course not. The banks always take care of those who serve them well.
Now, during Geithner's time at the Treasury, he went to great lengths to let people know that he was a lifelong civil servant. However, during the financial crisis, do you think that he ultimately served the interests of the bank more than, the interests of that would be served being a true civil servant?
Oh, sure, of course. That's the function of the Federal Reserve. It's to serve the interests of the banks. And in recent years, that's been the function of the Secretary of the Treasury. It's now also the function of the financial regulatory agencies. They all serve the interests of the banks. That's their function.
Now, since the beginning of the Fed itself, there's been a revolving door between Wall Street and the lender of last resort. Now, even Paul Warburg advocated for the creation of the Fed, and he was appointed to its first board by President Wilson. My question to you, how big of a problem is this revolving door, and is it something that needs to be prevented?
Well, they wouldn't be able to prevent it. The Federal Reserve was formed in order to serve the banks. The public is often told that it's there to provide full employment and low inflation, but that's just a cover story. The Federal Reserve is there to make sure that the big banks, not all the banks, just the few big banks, that nothing really goes wrong for them, and that's its function. And that's what it's been doing ever since Clinton.
Now, I want to talk about Yellen for a second. Do you think that recent Fed policy has been beneficial to the economy, kind of via Yellen, what's coming up with her, everything that she's been saying?
No, I don't think it has been, because it's created an enormous bubble in bonds and stocks. And it commits the Federal Reserve to printing huge amounts of new dollars. And the huge amount of money printing ultimately has to threaten the value of the dollar, people's confidence in it as world reserve currency. So I think it's really been detrimental for the economy, and it's certainly been detrimental for savers, especially retired people who don't like to risk their life savings in the stock market because they don't know they'll live long enough to see a recovery should the market correct. And they are dependent on interest income. They've had no interest income now for a number of years. So the policy of the Fed, it does not serve the American people or the economy. It serves the banks that are too big to fail. The whole purpose of the policy is to keep the prices of the debt-related securities or derivatives, the debt-related derivatives on the bank's books high. When you buy bonds, all debt prices rise with the treasuries, and they buy the mortgage-backed securities. This takes some of the toxic assets away from the big banks, and it supports the balance sheets of the banks and makes them look a lot more solvent. So that's the real purpose of the policy.
Now, it kind of begs the question, is the Fed itself experiencing diminished returns with its ongoing QE program? It sounds like you might think yes.
Well, I think that the Fed can't get out of it. The only way if they stop it, then we know bond prices will fall, interest rates will rise, stock prices will collapse, and they'll have a financial crisis. And the banks, the big banks, if they say that are too big to fail, they'll be in trouble again. So the Fed is kind of locked into this policy and really will have to continue it. I think it will continue until something happens to the dollar, because they keep printing more dollars. So if you're someone holding dollar-denominated assets, you're watching your dollar holdings be diluted at the tune of 1,000 billion a year. So at some point, the world may move away from the dollar. You know, they're already starting to move away from using the dollar as the currency for settling trade imbalances. The Chinese currency has now moved up to number 2nd. But of course, the dollar is still the major currency that's used to settle international trade accounts. At some point, if the demand for the dollar in that role declines substantially, this can break up the Fed's control and bring the whole thing to an end.
Now, you said right now, you said something happening to the dollar. What do you think that something will be?
Well, I think it's what we see happening. You know, the Chinese announced recently that they do not need to accumulate any more foreign currency reserves, by which they mean dollars. So that's an indication that they will cease to recycle their trade surpluses with the United States into the purchase of Treasury debt. So that means if they stop doing that, that the Federal Reserve, to keep the bond prices the same, will have to buy more bonds. And we see that China has an agreement with Japan and with Australia to settle their trade imbalances in their own currencies without using the dollar. And we have the BRICS, you know, Russia, China, Brazil, India, South Africa, making a similar agreement that they will settle their trade imbalances between themselves in their own currencies. So this means that the demand for dollar as the world currency, as a means of payment, falls. And so in the currency market, that should mean that the dollar's exchange rate falls relative to other currencies. When all these mechanisms are in place and are widely used, I would expect to see a lot of trouble for the value of the dollar. Now, since the United States is such an import-dependent country, it means all the imports of things coming into the country would then cost more. So the inflation would be imported into the country from the dollar's loss of exchange value. And so then the American people would be faced with both the relatively high level of unemployment that they're experiencing and inflation. And there's no real economic policy solution for that.
Now, Mr. Roberts, I want to start off this section by talking about former Fed official Andrew Huszar. Now, he published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, and in his piece, he claimed that the true purpose of QE was to support the banks. I want to ask you, is there a way to conduct monetary policy without benefiting the banks, or is this just an inevitable outcome of conducting monetary policy?
Well, yes, you could conduct a monetary policy with the benefit of the country in mind, with the stability of everyone job and purchasing power, but that's not what the Fed was created to do. It was created by the big banks to serve them, and they've controlled it ever since. So what Andrew Huszar says is exactly what I've been saying. It's just that he was the insider who originally implemented the policy of quantitative easing. And when he saw that what it was really for was to support the banks, he resigned. And that's very rare, but it shows that he has a lot of principle. So I don't think that without some kind of a revolution, that the power that the banks hold over the Fed could be broken. I think the Fed will continue to serve the banks.
Okay, now it seems that current Fed policy, it encourages private debt by keeping interest rates so low and for such long period of times. Do you see Fed policy shifting the power structure here in the U.S., kind of giving more power to the banks in some way?
Well, the financial crisis and the response to it has given a lot more power to the banks because of the consolidations that you reported at the beginning of this program. You find that they let the small banks fail and the big banks buy them. So the big banks get bigger and bigger and bigger. And there's no longer an antitrust act. And the argument used to be that competition required that you didn't let firms get too large to get too big of a share of the market, that they had to be able to compete against each other. But now what they say is, oh, we can't compete in the global economy unless the banks are huge, almost like monopolies. So I just don't see how the response to the financial crisis has done anything except benefit the banks.
Now, Larry Summers, he recently implied during an IMF gathering that it's not enough to merely give big banks interest-free money. More should be done for the banks. And Summers suggested instead of being paid interest on bank deposits, people should be penalized for keeping their money in banks instead of spending it. Now, I've wondered this for a long time, and you would know if it's possible or not. Why doesn't the Fed somehow come up with a scheme where it charges the banks to spend, aka lend, opposed to the banks charging people to spend?
Well, what Summers is really concocting is an excuse not only to continue quantitative easing, but to increase it. You see, Aaron, the only way you could get negative interest rates would be if the Federal Reserve purchased so many bonds that it was paying a premium for the bond over its face value. In other words, suppose it's a $100 bond, but the Fed drives up the prices to 102. So it pays more for the bond than the bond would ever be worth at maturity. That's how you drive down the interest rates. The only known way that I can come up with. So what this scheme of Larry Summers is, a former U.S. Treasury Secretary and Obama regime advisor, the scheme is to provide a policy argument for the Federal Reserve to purchase more bonds. In fact, so many more bonds that they're buying them at a premium over their face value. Now, that would give you a negative interest rate. So what would the people do? They would take their money out of the banks and do something else. So the next part of the scheme is, oh, well, we don't let people have cash anymore. There's only digital money. And that way they can't keep their money at home. They can only keep it in the bank accounts. And there we can penalize them for saving. You see, the Keynesian economic policy that dominated the United States until the supply-siders came along in the 1980s said that there's a natural rate of interest. And that natural rate is the rate that makes savings and investment equal at full employment. And what Summers is saying is that now the natural rate of interest is negative.
Wow.
Well, if this is an argument then for the Federal Reserve to buy yet more bonds and to be such a huge demand in the bond market that they pay premiums over the face value of the bond. So it looks like Summers thinks that quantitative easing must continue, it must increase, and that he has concocted an economic policy argument to justify that. That's what that's all about, in my opinion.
Now, I want to ask you about savings. The personal savings rate in the U.S. today is currently 2 percentage points below the average long term. How would the savings rate change under negative interest rate policy? Can you explain that?
Well, in Summers' argument, which was very well explained by Paul Krugman, they actually think that people are saving more than investors are investing, and therefore saving becomes a dilution from spending. So the consumers are spending money, and if they would just spend everything would be fine. But they're saving some, and so the part they're saving comes away from spending. Well, if the investors don't step in and borrow that saving and put it all back into the economy, then the spending stream has shrunk and employment rises. So this is the whole Keynesian view. And so it's associated with John Maynard Keynes. It goes back to before the Second World War. So with this view, savings is bad because it's a reduction from spending. And what's good is more spending. The more, the better. And so I think, in my own opinion, this argument that Summers and Krugman are making, it's really a cover for the continuation and increase of quantitative easing. They want to support the banks even stronger.
Mr. Roberts, that's all the time we have for now, but as always, thank you for your insight, and please come back on the show very soon. I could ask you a million more questions, so we'll have to in the near future. That was Paul Craig Roberts, economist and former Assistant Secretary to the Treasury for Economic Policy under Reagan. Time now for today's Big Deal.